I'm a 32-year-old guy, and for the past 5 years, I've been the one hosting every single holiday for my family. I'm talking Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, even minor holidays like Memorial Day. If it's a chance for the family to gather, it's at my place. It wasn't always my job, but when my grandma passed, the role sort of fell to me. She hosted for over 30 years, and I guess everyone just expected me to pick up where she left off. See, I live alone in a house with a big living room and a dining area that's perfect for hosting. It's nothing fancy, but it's got enough space for everyone. My older brother, he's 35 lives nearby, in a similar sized place, but it's never been on the table for him to take over. It's always just been a given that I'd host. He has a wife and 2 young kids, and whenever the idea of hosting comes up, he just brushes it off, saying how his place is too chaotic for a big gathering. Over the years, the family has gotten bigger. There are cousins with their own kids, aunts and uncles, some of them getting older. A typical holiday means about 20 people in my house. It's loud. There are kids running around, and everyone's got their own expectations. They like the way I cook, how I set up the decorations, and how I make everything feel just like Grandma used to. I've tried to keep up with it all. Bought new tablecloths, different lights for Christmas, and even those fancy serving dishes that I never use outside of these events. But here's the thing, the costs keep adding up. Between the food, drinks, decorations, and little extras to keep the kids entertained, it's not cheap. And I'm the one paying for it all. Last year I did the math, and I realized that I spent enough to cover a decent vacation for myself. Something I haven't done in years because every extra penny seems to go into these gatherings. Around this time last year, I finally got the courage to ask my family for a bit of help. Nothing crazy, just suggested that maybe everyone could chip in a little for the food or bring a side dish. I brought it up after dinner one night, thinking it would be a casual conversation. Instead, the room went dead silent. Everyone just stared at me like I'd broken some unspoken rule. My mom quickly changed the subject. My brother made a joke about me being Mr. Moneybags, and that was it. Next thing I knew, I was still footing the bill while they brought store-bought desserts and called it a contribution. The last Thanksgiving was kind of my breaking point. The whole family was over, eating and drinking and catching up, while I was running around making sure the turkey didn't burn and the drinks stayed filled. The dishwasher decided to quit halfway through the night, and by the time everyone left, I was stuck hand-washing dishes until nearly 2 a.m. Meanwhile, my family left early, saying how tired they were, without a second thought to the mess they left behind. I think that's when it hit me, how little time I actually get to enjoy these holidays myself. For my family, it's a chance to relax, to sit back and enjoy a home-cooked meal in a familiar place. But for me, it's become a full-time job. I wake up at the crack of dawn to start prepping, and by the time I'm finished cleaning up, it's like the day just vanished. And the pressure isn't just about the time and money, it's about the expectations. Every time I hint that maybe I won't host the next one, my mom just brushes it off with comments like, "But you're so good at it," or "It wouldn't be the same anywhere else." I even tried to bring it up gently at Christmas last year, saying something like, "Maybe it's time to pass the torch." My mom just looked at me and said, "Well, where else would we go?" My brother, of course, didn't jump in to offer his place. He just nodded along, like he didn't have a stake in it. I couldn't help but feel a bit resentful. It's not like he doesn't have the space or the means to help out. He just doesn't want the hassle. And meanwhile, I'm left juggling credit card debt because I keep trying to make each holiday special. I've been putting off having a serious talk with them, mostly because I'm worried about how they'll react. My parents are very traditional, and I know they'd be disappointed if I stopped hosting. They'd see it as me turning my back on the family legacy. But it's not just about the money or the work anymore. It's the fact that I feel taken for granted. For years, I've put up with it, telling myself that it's worth it to keep the family together. But lately, I'm starting to wonder if it's really worth the toll it's taking on me. I used to love the holidays, but now I just dread them. I dread the planning, the cooking, the cleaning, and the feeling of being overlooked. It's not a good place to be, and I know that if I don't make a change soon, I'm going to end up resenting my family even more. So, here I am, debating how to break the news to them that I need a break. I know it's going to cause drama, my family doesn't handle change well, but for the first time I feel like I need to put myself first, even if it means rocking the boat. I just hope they understand, or at least try to, before it's too late. Update 1. So I decided to rip off the band-aid. I invited my parents and my brother over for brunch at my place. Figured it would be easier to explain everything in person, without distractions. I went all out with the food, eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, the whole 9 yards. The mood was light when they arrived. My dad started talking about his golf game, my mom was asking about my neighbor's new dog, and my brother was busy scrolling through his phone while his kids played in the corner. It felt like a typical Sunday morning. Once everyone had eaten, I figured it was as good a time as any. I cleared my throat and told them that I needed to talk about the holidays this year. As soon as I brought it up, my mom's smile faded, and my brother stopped scrolling. My dad kept eating, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. I went straight into it, explaining that hosting was getting to be too much for me. I talked about the costs, how I've been putting everything on my credit card, and how I haven't really been able to enjoy the holidays myself. For a few seconds, there was just silence. My dad finally broke it, waving his hand like he was brushing away a fly. He said something about how it wasn't a big deal, and that the family could pitch in a little more this year, but he didn't really seem to get it. I tried to explain that it wasn't just the money, it was the time and effort too. I reminded them about the dishwasher breaking last Thanksgiving, how I'd been stuck doing dishes while everyone else was relaxing. I could see my mom starting to frown, her face getting that pinched look she always gets when she doesn't like what she's hearing. My mom jumped in, talking about how my grandmother had hosted every year without ever complaining, how it kept the family close. She brought up memories of my grandma's old house, how it had always felt like home, and how she thought I'd been doing a great job continuing that tradition. I just nodded along at first, but I tried to tell her that things were different now. Grandma didn't have to host 20 people while balancing a full-time job, and the costs back then weren't what they are now. My brother didn't seem interested in the details. He just shrugged, like he couldn't see why it was such a big deal. He made a comment about how we'd figure it out, but he didn't offer any ideas or solutions. It was the same old story, no responsibility on him, just expectations that I'd keep doing what I always did. I could feel my frustration growing, but I kept my tone calm. I brought up the idea that maybe he and his wife could host this year. He immediately deflected, saying that with the kids, their place just wasn't suitable for hosting a big family event. It was almost like he'd prepared the excuse in advance. Then my mom shifted tactics. She started talking about how much the kids looked forward to Christmas at my place, how they'd be disappointed if they couldn't have it there. It was subtle, but I could feel the pressure behind her words. She talked about the way the kids' eyes light up when they see my decorations and how much they loved the little traditions I'd kept alive. I bit my tongue for a moment, letting her finish, but I knew I couldn't back down this time. I repeated that I needed a break and suggested that maybe we could start rotating the hosting duties. I tried to keep things as gentle as possible, but I could tell they weren't happy. My brother mumbled something under his breath about how some people just aren't as generous as others. I didn't respond, but it stung. He didn't have to say it out loud for me to know what he meant. By that point, the mood was completely different from when we'd started. My dad was looking annoyed, my mom was staring down at her coffee cup, and my brother just seemed irritated. It wasn't exactly the supportive conversation I'd hoped for. I cleared the plates and tried to keep things moving, but the energy was off. My parents didn't stay long after that, saying they had errands to run. My brother left with barely a goodbye, and the brunch just kind of fizzled out. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a long text from my mom. She went on about how much the holidays meant to the family, how it was important to keep traditions alive, and how she hoped I'd reconsider. I could almost hear her voice as I read it, the same tone she'd used when I'd gotten into trouble as a kid. It was all about the family and how much they'd miss spending time together if I backed out. I ended up calling a few friends after that, just to get it off my chest. They were a lot more understanding than my family had been. They told me I wasn't being unreasonable, that it made sense to want a break after so many years. It felt good to have someone on my side for once, even if it wasn't my family. One of my friends suggested I post about it on Reddit, so I did. I wrote out the whole situation on one of those family drama subreddits, trying to keep it anonymous. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of comments poured in, with people telling me to stick to my guns, that it wasn't fair for my family to expect so much from me without pitching in. Some people shared their own stories about similar situations, and it made me feel a little less alone. There were a few comments calling me selfish, but for the most part, people seemed to understand where I was coming from. By the end of the night, I felt a little more confident about my decision. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and I knew there would be more drama to come, but I wasn't going to back down this time. I realized that if I kept letting them push me around, nothing would ever change. I just had to hope that they'd eventually come around, even if it meant some tension along the way. Update 2. Not long after that brunch, I started hearing whispers. My cousin, she's 29, reached out to me on a Wednesday night, out of the blue. We've always been on good terms, but we don't usually chat outside of family gatherings. So when I saw her name pop up on my phone, I figured something was up. She told me she'd been talking to my brother and his wife, and apparently they weren't happy about my decision to step back from hosting. She said they'd been telling other relatives that I was being selfish for refusing to keep up the tradition. According to them, I was the one breaking the family apart. She didn't sugarcoat it. She told me straight up that they were painting me as the bad guy, the one causing all this unnecessary drama, and it stung. I hadn't expected my brother to take it that far, but I guess he felt like he needed to win some points with the rest of the family. And then came the family group chat drama. A few days later, someone, I'm pretty sure it was my mom, dropped a message about how much they'd miss our usual Christmas at my place. It was vague, but the intent was clear. A few aunts and cousins chimed in, saying how different it would feel and how it wouldn't be the same. Nobody mentioned me directly, but it was like everyone knew who they were talking about. It made me feel like I'd thrown a wrench into the family plans, like I was the one ruining their holiday. My cousin messaged me privately again after that, saying she understood why I wanted to take a step back. She even admitted she was frustrated with how nobody ever helped out when I hosted, how they all just showed up, ate, and left. It was nice to know someone saw things from my perspective. She also let slip a little secret that caught me off guard. My brother and his wife were planning a vacation to Europe next summer. They'd been saving up for it for a while now. I was stunned. Here's my brother complaining that I'm being selfish, refusing to chip in for holiday expenses, but meanwhile, he's planning a luxury trip. The same guy who acted like pitching in a bit for Christmas dinner was too much to ask. It felt like a punch to the gut. I debated confronting him about it right away, but I decided to hold off. I needed time to figure out what to say without making the whole situation even worse. The tension with my parents didn't let up either. They kept calling every few days, asking if I'd changed my mind yet about hosting Christmas. It was like they thought I'd eventually cave if they kept the pressure on. Each call was a reminder that they didn't really hear me back at that brunch. It was always the same thing, how it wouldn't feel like Christmas if we didn't gather at my place, how my grandma would want the tradition to continue. They didn't seem to realize that I needed a break, or they just didn't care. At this point, I was starting to feel the weight of everything I'd put into these holidays. One night, I sat down with my receipts and credit card statements from the past few years. I tallied up how much I'd spent on food, decorations, gifts, and everything else that went into making each holiday special. When I saw the total, I couldn't believe it. It was enough for a down payment on a car. I'd been blowing all this money to keep up a tradition that no one else even bothered to support financially. It made me feel foolish, but more than that, it made me angry. That cousin of mine, she was the only one offering any kind of support. She suggested hosting a small holiday gathering herself this year, something different, just for a change of pace. It was a nice gesture, and I appreciated it. So I brought up the idea to my parents. I told them maybe we could go to her place this year, keep it low-key. But they shot it down almost immediately, saying it wouldn't be the same as it is at my house. They acted like I hadn't even said anything, and the conversation shifted back to their usual guilt-tripping. Eventually, I had a private talk with my brother. I tried to keep it casual, like I wasn't too bothered, but I brought up the vacation plans. He got defensive right away, accusing me of being jealous. He didn't see any connection between that trip and what I'd been asking for. He acted like they were two completely separate things. His trip was their reward for saving up, while me asking for help was me being unreasonable. We went back and forth for a bit, but I could tell he wasn't going to change his mind. He kept insisting that I was overreacting, that I was the one making things difficult. After that, things got awkward between us. We'd see each other at smaller family get-togethers, and there was this tension hanging in the air. Our conversations were short, with these uncomfortable silences in between. It was like there was this unspoken thing between us now, and neither of us wanted to address it directly in front of the rest of the family. My parents picked up on the weirdness, but they didn't ask questions. I think they figured it had to do with me refusing to host. As the weeks went on, I felt more and more drained. It was exhausting trying to defend my decision over and over again. Every time the holidays came up, it turned into a fight or a guilt trip, and I was tired of feeling like I was constantly on the defensive. But even with all the pressure, I knew I couldn't back down now. I'd come this far, and if I gave in, I'd end up right back where I started. I just kept hoping that eventually they'd understand, or at least accept that I wasn't going to change my mind. Update 3. A few days after that tense conversation with my brother, I thought things might finally settle down. I was wrong. One Saturday afternoon, I was lounging on my couch, catching up on a TV show, when I heard a knock on my front door. When I opened it, there stood my parents. They hadn't called or texted to say they were coming over, which wasn't normal for them. My mom had that look she gets when she's on a mission, and my dad was standing just behind her, arms crossed. They walked into the living room without waiting for an invitation, and I had a feeling I knew where this was going. My mom glanced around at the place, as if looking for signs of the usual holiday prep that wasn't happening this year. My dad just gestured for me to sit down. They started talking about how they needed to have a heart-to-heart with me, how this was all about family traditions and keeping everyone close. My mom started in on how much it meant to her that I kept up what Grandma had done all those years. She brought up childhood memories, how my grandma would put up her Christmas village, how the whole family would squeeze into her little living room for dinner. She even pulled out some old photos, like she thought showing me pictures of past holidays would change my mind. At first, I just sat there listening, trying to keep the peace. I knew how much this stuff meant to her, but as she kept going, I felt more and more cornered. She wasn't just reminiscing, she was trying to make me feel guilty for even thinking about changing things. My dad was leaning in, nodding along with every word, backing her up. They were treating this like some intervention, like I needed to be convinced that stepping back from hosting was a mistake. Then my dad jumped in with his own twist. He said that if I wasn't willing to host this year, then maybe the family just shouldn't celebrate Christmas at all. He kept saying that if the family couldn't be together at my place, then what was the point? It felt like he was giving me some kind of ultimatum, and I could tell he expected me to cave. But instead, I felt something snap. I'd been holding back for weeks, listening to all the comments and pressure, but this time I couldn't just nod and go along with it. I cut him off, my voice louder than I intended, and told them I was done being treated like the family's personal holiday planner. I said I was tired of feeling like I was just a host, not a part of the family. My parents just stared at me, wide-eyed. They definitely hadn't expected me to push back like that. My mom looked shocked, like she couldn't believe I was actually standing up to them. My dad's jaw tightened, and I could tell he was about to jump in with something else, but I wasn't done. I told them that I needed a break, and that I wasn't going to change my mind, no matter how much they tried to guilt me into it. That's when my mom's eyes welled up with tears. She started talking about how she felt like the family was falling apart, and how she couldn't believe I would let that happen. She kept saying things like, "I thought you cared about keeping us all together," and I could hear the accusation behind her words. My dad just shook his head, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I got up, went over to the side table, and grabbed the folder where I'd been keeping all my receipts and credit card statements from past holidays. I laid them out on the coffee table in front of them, pointing out the costs for food, drinks, decorations, everything that had gone into making those holiday gatherings happen. For a moment, they both went quiet, staring at the numbers. My mom's tears stopped, and my dad looked genuinely speechless. But it didn't last. My dad brushed off the receipts, saying that the money wasn't the real issue here. He accused me of being self-centered for focusing on the financial side of things instead of the emotional aspect of family gatherings. He said I was making this all about myself and not thinking about what it meant to everyone else. I wasn't backing down this time, though. I told him that if keeping these traditions alive was so important, then maybe the rest of the family should be willing to take turns hosting or at least contribute more. I wasn't asking for much, just a little bit of fairness. But I could see from their faces that they weren't interested in fairness. They just wanted me to go back to how things were before. My dad stood up, shaking his head, and said something about how I'd regret this when I was spending Christmas alone. My mom was still sniffling, but she got up too, wiping her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her purse. They headed for the door without saying much else. I watched them leave, feeling a weird mix of relief and sadness as they drove away. Part of me knew that this might have changed things between us for good. That night, I ended up posting another update on Reddit. I wrote out what had happened, how they'd shown up out of nowhere, how the conversation had gone off the rails. I didn't expect much, but the response was overwhelming again. People told me I was doing the right thing, that I needed to stand my ground. They shared their own stories about dealing with family expectations, and it helped to know I wasn't the only one going through this kind of mess. Seeing those comments made me feel like I wasn't losing my mind, like maybe I wasn't the villain in this story after all. I don't know where things are going to go from here with my parents, but I'm more sure than ever that I made the right call. Maybe this Christmas will be different, maybe it'll be quieter, but at least it'll be on my own terms. Update 4. I was set on having a quiet Christmas this year, just me, a stack of movies, and some takeout from my favorite Chinese place. After everything that had gone down with my parents, I figured a peaceful day by myself would be better than dealing with more drama. I wasn't planning on reaching out to anyone, and honestly, I didn't expect anyone to reach out to me either. My parents had made it clear that if I wasn't hosting, they wouldn't be celebrating. I figured they'd stay true to their word. On Christmas Eve, I just settled in with a plate of dumplings when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from my cousin, the one who'd been on my side throughout all of this. She told me she was hosting a small holiday dinner at her place and asked if I wanted to join. It wasn't going to be a big production, just her kids, and a few of our other cousins. She promised it would be super low-key and everyone would bring something. At first, I hesitated. I'd gotten used to the idea of spending the holiday alone, and I wasn't sure I wanted to risk stepping back into family drama, even on a smaller scale. But she insisted, saying it wouldn't be the same without me, and I realized that I really didn't want to spend Christmas completely alone. So I texted back and told her I'd be there. Her place was cozy, with a few decorations up, but nothing over the top like the kind of setup I used to do. She had a simple tree in the corner and a table covered with food that everyone had pitched in to bring. It was a different vibe from the big family Christmases we'd had at my place, more relaxed, less polished, but in a way that made it feel more genuine. There were only a handful of us, my cousin, her husband, their 2 kids, and a couple of our other cousins with their kids. Everyone seemed happy to just be together, without the pressure of a picture-perfect holiday. People brought dishes they'd made at home, from casseroles to pies. We sat around the table, sharing stories and eating until we couldn't move. It was the first time in years that I wasn't running back and forth to the kitchen or worrying about making sure everything was perfect. Just when I thought the night couldn't surprise me anymore, my brother showed up. He'd heard about the gathering through our cousin, and he arrived looking a little awkward, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. He didn't bring his wife or kids, which was unusual for him. He just walked in, hands in his pockets, and gave me a small nod. It was strange, but I let it slide and grabbed him a plate. After dinner, he pulled me aside while everyone else was chatting in the living room. It wasn't like him to want to talk one-on-one, so I knew he had something on his mind. He apologized, stumbling over his words. He admitted that he might have overreacted to me stepping back from hosting, and that he hadn't thought about how much work it really was for me all these years. I decided not to beat around the bush and brought up the vacation plans I'd heard about. He seemed embarrassed, shuffling his feet and mumbling that they'd been saving up for it for a while. He explained that they hadn't meant to hide it from me, but he knew it looked bad given how he'd reacted when I asked for help with the holidays. He admitted that maybe they could have pitched in more. I told him I wasn't angry about the vacation, I just wanted my decision to be respected. I laid it out clearly I needed a break from hosting, and that wasn't going to change. I told him that if the rest of the family wanted the holidays to stay as special as they used to be, they needed to step up too. He nodded slowly, like he was really listening for the first time. It wasn't some miracle moment where everything suddenly got better between us, but I could feel the tension ease a little. He promised we'd talk more in the new year about how to make things fairer going forward. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like a step in the right direction. We rejoined the group, and for the rest of the night, things felt a little less strained between us. My parents didn't reach out on Christmas Day just like they'd said. It was strange not hearing from them, especially since they'd always made such a big deal out of family being together during the holidays. I tried not to dwell on it too much, focusing instead on enjoying the evening at my cousin's place. Still, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness that things had gotten to this point. That night, after I got back home, I posted another update on Reddit. I talked about the dinner at my cousin's place, how my brother had shown up and actually apologized. The responses poured in, with people saying how proud they were that I'd stood my ground, and that it sounded like my brother was starting to come around. A lot of folks reminded me that setting boundaries is hard, but it's necessary, even when it means dealing with some uncomfortable moments. As I looked ahead to the new year, I felt a sense of determination. I knew things wouldn't magically fix themselves overnight, but I was committed to maintaining my boundaries no matter how much pushback I got. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about making sure I didn't end up in the same place I'd been in for the last 5 years. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I could handle whatever came next. Update 5. New Year's Day rolled around, and I just finished cleaning up from a small get-together with a few friends when my phone rang. It was my mom. She sounded different this time, quieter, more subdued than I'd ever heard her. I could tell right away that she wasn't calling to push me about hosting. She asked if she and my dad could come over to talk things through. She emphasized that it wouldn't be another argument, just a chance to finally understand each other. I hesitated. The last time we'd talked face-to-face, it hadn't gone well, but she sounded sincere, so I agreed on the condition that this would be a calm conversation, not another attempt to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. She agreed, and they made plans to come over that afternoon. When they arrived, it wasn't like the last time. My mom wasn't holding on to old photo albums or trying to bring up family memories. My dad didn't have that look of frustration he'd had during our last talk. They sat down on the couch looking almost nervous. My mom started by apologizing for how they'd handled everything. She said they hadn't realized how much they'd been taking me for granted. My dad nodded, saying he hadn't meant to make it seem like I was selfish for wanting a break. Then my mom did something I didn't expect. She started talking about her own struggles with losing my grandma. She explained how, after grandma passed, she'd clung to the holiday traditions because they made her feel like a piece of my grandma was still there with us. She said that when I took over hosting, it felt like a way to keep that connection alive. But she admitted that she hadn't thought about what it might have been like for me to take on that responsibility all by myself. It was the first time I'd seen my parents open up like that. Hearing my mom talk about how hard it had been for her made me understand a little better why they'd been so resistant to the change. I could see that this wasn't just about wanting things to stay the same, it was about them trying to hold on to a part of the past. It didn't excuse everything, but it made some of their reactions make more sense. I told them that I hadn't meant to hurt them either, but that it had been exhausting to handle the holidays on my own for so long. I explained how it felt like no one really saw what I was doing or how much effort it took, and how after a while it made the holidays feel like a burden instead of something to look forward to. My mom teared up again, but this time it wasn't from anger. She said she wished she'd realized sooner and that she never wanted me to feel that way. My dad took a deep breath and suggested that maybe we could find a compromise. He proposed that instead of sticking to the old tradition, we could start having smaller, more informal gatherings throughout the year. He thought it might be a way to keep the family close without putting all the pressure on one person. My mom seemed a little hesitant, but she nodded along, agreeing that it was worth a try. In the middle of this, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. He'd heard from our mom that they were at my place, and he wanted to join the conversation, virtually at least. He offered to host a family barbecue this summer as a way to start spreading out the hosting duties. It wasn't a holiday, but it was a first step, and I could tell he was making an effort. It felt like maybe we were all starting to get on the same page. We talked about how to handle future holidays, agreeing that everyone would pitch in more, even if it meant doing things differently than we had before. My parents looked a little disappointed when I reiterated that I wouldn't be hosting every holiday anymore, but they didn't push back this time. They seemed to understand that I needed things to change if I was going to enjoy the holidays again. After they left, I felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. I was glad we'd had the talk and that they'd apologized, but I knew that change wouldn't come easy for them. It was one thing to agree in the moment, but another to follow through when the next holiday rolled around. Still, it felt like progress, and that was more than I'd expected after how things had gone before. That night, I posted one final update on Reddit, sharing how the conversation had gone. I thanked everyone for their support and for giving me the courage to stand my ground. The responses were overwhelming again. People told me they were glad to see things moving in a better direction, and that it sounded like I'd managed to reach a middle ground. Some even shared their own stories of difficult talks with family, reminding me that these things take time. As I looked ahead to the new year, I knew I'd still have to navigate some tricky family dynamics, but I felt like I was on more solid ground, like I wasn't just being pushed around by expectations anymore. Maybe this next chapter with my family wouldn't be perfect, but at least it felt like we were finally starting to understand each other. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could actually look forward to what came next.